Grief is real, big, better shared. The podcast everyone needs to hear, but nobody wants to hear.
I'm Diane Brockmeyer, the CEO of Mid-America Transplant, and we are honored to sponsor this episode of Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared. At Mid-America Transplant, we have the privilege of working with families across southern Missouri and northeast Arkansas who choose to donate their loved ones' organs or tissues. While donation often brings families comfort, they are still heartbroken by their loss. We are proud to work with the Center for Good Grief and appreciate everything they are doing in the region to help bring healing to people who are coping with loss. Grief support is especially meaningful to me, as it was a tremendous help to my daughter, who lost her dad when she was 7 years old. 20 years later, she still recalls the positive, safe feelings she had with her grief support group. They understood her. Mid-America Transplant is inspired by life and by the donor families who give transplant patients a second chance. For more information about becoming a donor, visit sayyesgivelife.org.
Hello. Welcome to Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared, the podcast everyone needs to hear, but nobody wants to hear. I'm Angela Hamblin-Kelly, the administrator of the Baptist Centers for Good Grief, and I'm joined here with three of my incredible colleagues to talk more about childhood and adolescent grief. So welcome back, Barbara, Lauren, and Hannah. But also, this episode will include actual interviews with children and teens talking themselves about childhood and adolescent grief. Let's jump back in and talk more specifically about our grieving teens. So when we talk about teenagers, we need to think about teens developmentally and how their different development actually can impact their grief as well.
Absolutely. And teens are they're my favorite. I love teens because they're in this interesting place where they're not really kids, but they are kids. They're not really adults, but they're really trying to be an adult. And the way I usually describe it to parents is their job as a teenager is to practice being a little mini adult in the safety and the nest of your care. And so we see with teens, oftentimes they lean more on their peers when they're in grief. They're turning more to that support system because that's what they're going to need when they, quote unquote, leave the nest and become these adults. And so we see kids distancing themselves a little bit from their parents and leaning more on their friends. And that's normal, natural, healthy, and remembering that they're not quite adults yet. So they still do need their parents. They still do need to be able to be a kid. In our last episode, we talked a lot about regression with little kids, and we can see that with teens too. You know, they may need extra support from us as adults while they're grieving.
Absolutely. And with that, we also have to be in mind of or be mindful of potential complications that can result from their grief because of that development, because it is a natural developmental phase to begin separating, distancing from the family, becoming my own person, forming my own identity. And because that's where a teen is developmentally, and then if there is a very significant death that happens, then that we need to think about what are those potential complications that can come from that.
Yeah, one thing that we see a lot of times with teens is that they can be somewhat withdrawn in their grief. And I think there's a number of different reasons for that. One is that I think that sometimes there can be a protectiveness of their family members. It's hard to see people we love hurting, so it's hard for teens to see their family members hurting. And so sometimes they may try to keep their grief close to their chest so as not to upset other people, or maybe they just try to avoid those situations where they see other people hurting. And as we talked in the last episode, the goal is not to respond to that by hiding our grief from them. We want to teach them that it's okay for everyone in the family to grieve, and that it's important for everyone to express their grief and to remember those we love who have died. But that is something that we commonly see, especially with this age group, is that they just tend to keep their grief a little bit closer to their chest and may need a little bit of extra support and encouragement in knowing that it's okay to express it. And another thing that we see sometimes kind of related to this is there may be a fear of intimacy, that they're scared of getting too close to people for fear of losing somebody again. So sometimes some of those distancing type behaviors are an attempt to protect themselves from future hurt.
And we know with teens also, there's a lot of identity formed in teen years. That's where, like we said, developmentally, they're pulling away from their families. They're becoming more of their own person. They're defining who they are. They're making some choices that maybe, I want to do this differently than my family, or I want to keep this, tradition or this value that my family has taught me. And really, we're doing a lot of work on who they are as teens. And then when we have a significant death during those teen years, that changes that identity. That's true for, I think, all grieving people, that it changes our identity. We define ourselves by our relationships. We talk a lot about that here at the center. And it also changes the way we see the world and how we interact with the world. I'm no longer maybe I'm no longer a sister, but I'm a bereaved sister. And that can really change the way I see myself, define myself. And so that is a big piece, I think, with teenagers, just because developmentally they're already working on it. And that is such a complicating factor to that development of their own identity when we throw grief in there. And maybe even they're the only ones in their class or the only ones in their friend group that is a bereaved teen. And that can become a piece of their identity. And we have some teens that tell us, well, I don't want to be seen as my grief. I don't want to be the sad one. I don't want, to come to the sleepover or the football game or whatever it may be. And I walk in and everyone's like, oh, they're so-and-so. She's the sad one. I think teens have an ability to kind of put one label on themselves and think that's their whole person. And so working through that, I think is a big job, and they need support from a lot of different angles on that. Of course, their friends, their family, and here at the center, we also support them on that.
Yeah, and I think a way that we do that is talking a lot with teens specifically about how we can have more than one feeling at a time. I know, teens can really relate to the idea of wearing masks, and that this is the mask I wear with my friend group. Like you said, Hannah, when you said that, I could hear so many teens I've worked with, I don't want to be the sad one. So they put that mask on of, oh, I'm happy and everything's great. And then, maybe that true sad mask is what is revealed at home when they're alone in their room or things like that. So, I think that's very real and very important to remember with these teens.
And I think, too, sometimes it may be their first experience with death.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, death is very real. And so that can change some of their perceptions. And I don't know, sometimes I've heard teens be very frustrated with their peer group because they're concerned about, well, what am I going to wear to school tomorrow? And they're like, my parent just died.
Right.
That is ridiculous that you're concerned about what you're going to wear to school tomorrow. So there's some frustration there. Mm-hmm. But they're searching for meaning and trying to figure out what does that mean to me now? And I do think that some of the positives is that we do see an increase in compassion for others because they're more sensitive to what maybe other people are going through. And then I guess all of us have worked at the center long enough that we've seen kids who have grown into young adults and have chosen to go into the health professions, whether it's being doctors and nurses and social workers, that there is that part of them that wants to give back, and it's had a positive impact on their lives.
Absolutely. We have one working towards being a grief counselor.
And I tell you, got one sitting here too, right?
right.
That was really,
That's right.
really influential in my career choices is my grief as a young adult.
There's two of you sitting here. So, yeah, and so I definitely think those vocational choices sometimes shift in those developmental years as well. And I think too, talking about development is just, and I think we have to talk about this, is the world we live in right now. You know, these teenagers from a developmental standpoint, you know, cognitively, their brains are just developing and changing, and they can see the world in a bigger, more global way. And so they see what's happened in their world, but then they are also seeing what's happening in our world, and trying to process that and trying to figure it out. And sometimes those are really hard questions as, well, what does it all matter? You know, when there's a school shooting here and there's a shooting here, and then this has happened in my life. And so I think, again, that's something really important to think about with teenagers, with their development, is as their thought processes evolve, you know, they're going to talk about bigger subjects. And I think as adults, we have to acknowledge we don't have the answers. You know, we may be struggling with some of those very same questions, but then acknowledging that with them, that that's a universal struggle. So, well, just like in our last episode, I asked some families, you know, what are some questions that you have struggled with, or how you have wondered or have had to find the answers to with your own grieving adolescent. So let's kind of talk through some of these real questions from real families. And so one was, and we get this a lot, what do I do? How do I respond when my teenager acts like they just don't care?
Well, I think the first thing is to remember that, like Hannah said, where they are developmentally and how they're trying to separate from their family. So it can be very normal. And like Angela, you mentioned about the mask, that sometimes they don't want to show their real feelings and they put on a mask that they're fine. And many times I use with parents or caregivers, I'll say, when the car window is down, you go in. And when it's up, it's up. And just be okay with that. And I've had a lot of teens say that they really dislike being asked, how are you feeling,
Yes.
50 times a day by the caregiver, wanting to know, just needing to know how they're doing. So find different ways to engage them in conversation and just be patient.
So what would that look like? What are some other ways that we can engage teens without saying, how are you? Because we know they do not like that.
I've had some families where they have a conversation about this and kind of create a plan. What's a good way for me to check in with you without annoying you, right?
Excellent.
Yes. And I've heard different ways. Some families will just send each other a text message and give the day a letter grade. Was today A, B, C, D, or F?
Love it.
I've had other families that just send each other an emoji. You know, if you could do one emoji to describe your day, what would it be? And that provides you with that check-in, with that little insight, and it invites the teen to talk more if they would like, and it gives them the option to not share if they're not feeling like sharing. It gives them that independence, a choice.
Well, going back to what we talked about a lot in our last episode is asking the teen, asking the child, giving them their voice in their grief. And the fact is, I love you and I care about you and I'm going to want to know how your day is. So help me know how to do that in the least annoying way possible. Right?
And that's going to look different for
Right.
each teen, right? Because no teen, no person grieves in the same way.
Right.
And so what is helpful or not helpful to one may not be, or maybe be completely different for the other. And I've seen a lot of families who have found it helpful or I guess more effective to talk with their teen while they're doing something else. In general, teenagers do not like to be put on the spot. They do not like to feel like all of the attention is on them. They're not going to often respond well to just sitting down across from an adult and saying exactly how they're feeling. Some will, but many won't. And so if you're doing something else where you're maybe side by side, maybe you're working on something, riding in the car, cooking dinner, whatever it may be, doing something with your hands, it creates an environment where a lot of times teens feel more comfortable talking because it doesn't feel like all of the attention is directly on them.
And providing that opportunity with you out of the room can be helpful too. And it gives them that independence to say, okay, I know I need to check in with my loved one today. So we've had families that do a family journal. You leave a journal out and you can communicate through the journal. And when you're finished with it, you put it back in its place and another family member can pick it up. I've also had families slap some of those magnets on the fridge with the different words, and you can write poems or messages or whatever it may be just on the fridge as you're walking through the house. And they can kind of tackle that whenever they feel like they're ready.
I've been a big advocate for grieving families to kind of start off with a weekly meeting. And I know that sounds kind of corporate and strange, but life is strange. Life is different. It makes no sense. So we need to regroup. And so we're going to pull together. And again, I think it helps children and teens know that, okay, on Sunday at 5 o'clock, this is what we do. This is an expectation of our family now. And we're going to come together and we're going to come up with a plan together. And so that's, again, I think important for our listeners, really including your children and teens in the discussion. And then you as the adult providing the structure and then the schedule. Show up. Don't let it just fall away. Show up. Continue to show up, because that's one of the biggest gifts you can give your teens is by continuing to show up. They remember, even if they don't act like they do, but they want to know that they're important to you.
And I think that's just perfect to have those weekly meetings, because then when those special dates roll around,
Yes.
whether it's a special holiday or birthday or anniversary, then the family's together and can get everyone's input about what they would like to do, how they would like to honor their loved one. And it just flows naturally then.
Yeah. And it keeps grief from being this secret, because secrets just bring a feeling of shame or something's wrong with us. And when we're doing that, it just is allowing the conversation that this has happened. We have lost this person, but we are still a family, and we're going to, like we said earlier in our last episode, we're going to be okay because we're going to do it together.
And it prioritizes it too,
Yes,
right? Because you as a
absolutely.
family, I don't know, I'm making this up, but like, what if you guys go to, I don't know, a baseball game every week because someone has a baseball game, or you always go out to eat one night a week? And if our teens see that, like if we're prioritizing, we always go out to eat once a week, but we're not prioritizing our family meeting, that communicates a lot to our teens, and they pick up on that. And so that consistency, that not monthly, that weekly meeting
Right.
is communicating to them, this is out in the open, this is something we talk about, this isn't a secret, and it's a priority.
Yeah. And it matters.
And it increases their comfort level, kind of like what you were
Right.
saying. Grief is not such a big secret, but also they get to practice talking
Yes.
about it.
Yes.
A lot of times when we avoid something, the anxiety about that increases the longer we avoid it. And so, if they've had more exposure to talking about their grief and it just being openly acknowledged, and more of an opportunity to practice talking about their feelings and hearing those words of grief and death and feeling words and all of that, then it increases their comfort level with being able to use them.
Absolutely. And I think this also just goes back to development for adolescents and Hannah, you mentioned this, it's normal for adolescents to, rely on their friend group and their peer group more, and starting to really use them more as support from their family. And I think this brings back the importance of that family, especially with grief, because we are grieving as a family. And even though friends and peers are important and have a role, but as a family, our family grief is important as well.
And our family identity,
Yes.
keeping our family identity, certainly.
Absolutely. So let's talk about, so here's another question from a family, is how honest should I be with my teen about death and then grief as well?
These teenagers, they are observant, and I think they'll sniff it out if you're being inauthentic, if your behavior and your talk is incongruent. So honesty is the best policy with teens. Of course, we want to be developmentally appropriate. We don't want to include maybe details just for the sake of including details that could be upsetting. And also the day and age we live in. Teenagers can look up news articles. They can, talk to other people. They will find out is
They
what
will.
That's my experience is they're going to find out. And then especially with teens, if we aren't forthcoming with that information, that is a betrayal of trust. That is a big no-no with teens. You know, they're big on trust. And if we're kind of keeping something a secret or withholding, even if our intention is protection, even if our intention is good, it is unlikely that our teen will feel that way when they find out. Even if they find out as an adult, there will be some questions. Why did you keep this from me? And that can be a really hard conversation. It can cause more hurt and more pain than it would just to kind of face this head on together and be able to provide that information and provide a supportive environment to give that information and controlling that narrative. I'm a big fan of, you know what, we want to control the narrative to be helpful. We want it to be healthy. We want it to be honest. And that's, like we said, really supporting that idea of a family culture. We're in this as a family. You know, your grief is just as important as my grief as an adult, and your relationship is just as important. And you deserve to know this about your loved one.
And that's why this podcast and, you know, podcasts like this are so important, because that's hard. That's hard for families to do. These conversations are hard. So listeners, please know we hear that, and that's why we're doing this. That's why there's the Baptist Centers for Good Grief. You know, how do I talk to my teen about suicide? How do I that is a hard word. That's a hard thing for adults to process. So how do I begin to do that with my teen? Or, you know, other types of deaths, or, you know, just details that may be traumatic in nature. And it's important to talk that through with somebody so that you can then give that best information to your teen. Just go around and each of you can just kind of introduce yourself. You can just say your first name, maybe how old you are, what you do, whatever you want to say, and then maybe how old you were, like when you went to camp.
My name is Elijah. I am 25 now. I want to say I was about 12 or 13 when I went to camp, and I'm an amazing accountant / photographer, so, you know, life's looking up for me.
I'm Aaron. See, how old am I? I'm 22 now. I'll be 23 at the end of the month, so going up there. But and I was 13 going on 14 when I was at camp. So it's been about 10 years now, almost. So
I am Philip. I am an accountant or intern accountant for now. Party.
Let me ask you about, what would you want grieving kids, their parents, their families to know about Camp Good Grief and the centers and the importance of grief work? The whole point of this podcast is to help people understand that children and teenagers do in fact grieve.
Yes.
They just grieve differently. So what do you think now as young adults it's important for parents to know about children's grief, or families to know?
To listen. I know, thank God for my mom, but a lot of people didn't believe I was grieving. Like, when my dad passed, it was really hard to deal with, and I felt a lot of them. Of course, like, I was sad, but, like, then I would start thinking dark thoughts, and to hear people just, Elijah, that was forever ago. Like, you have to learn to deal with it. That was the part that always sucked. Like just, it was basically get over it. And that hurt. And to know that, you know, I explained my grief to friends and even family members, and to get that kind of answer, and to feel like my emotions didn't matter really sucked. But to know there was a place to where I could explain myself and how I was feeling, and to know that other people felt the same way, it felt nice. But if parents friends, if they were to pick up one thing, it's just to listen. Like, I know how kids can be, I know how teenagers can be, I know how adults can be, but like, just listen, because if I'm sharing this with you, clearly I care about you enough, and I care about your opinion enough, and I want to express these things to you, and ultimately I want to feel better, and I'm coming to you, telling you these things, and oh, well, that's life. Oh, it'll get better. Like, but when, how, like, to have all these questions, and to have a mother that goes, you know what, I don't have the answers, but let's try to find it. Like, that's something magical. Like, just walk with them.
That's great.
I would say, I kind of, like you, my mom was my biggest supporter when I lost my dad, and she continues to be. So I would say, I think that the biggest thing to know is that, like, your kid's going to be okay. I think for me, kind of just the circumstances surrounding my dad's death, there was a lot of trauma and things like that, and there was a lot of concern for me personally from my mom and people around me, like kind of how I was going to turn out, and just making sure I was going to be okay. But here I am, almost 23, almost 10 years later. I've got a career. I just got my bachelor's degree. So I've done a lot of fighting to get to where I am. And so I think that's the thing to remember about other kids and their parents, is that, they're going to be okay, that it may not look like it. Maybe they're having a really hard time, especially losing a parent, because that's the worst thing to kind of know that. And especially as I get older, I kind of think about this now, that I'm hitting so many milestones without my dad. And at this point, I've spent more of my life without my dad than I did with him. So that's a weird thing to kind of think about. But again, like, I turned out okay, and I know that, like, other people can, especially when they have the right support system and things like the Grief Center that really help them to get to a good place. So
I like how you highlighted, because this is important to me, especially with you, is how hard you have fought, and I think we have to remember that kids can fight hard in their grief to live happy, healthy lives with their grief. And so I'm glad that word really stuck with me, resonated with just knowing you so well. You have worked really hard. And I mean, all three of you have. I'm not saying that, but that says a lot, AJ.
In this situation, I feel like don't treat him as a child. In this situation, try to give him a straightforward answer. Try to give him an answer that is if they were another, like, person that you'd meet at a coffee shop, if anything. But
That's very good. And I think, Philip, that's such a good point that I think parents and family members need to hear, is talking honestly,
Yes.
being honest. And obviously we want to be age appropriate.
Oh, yeah.
But
just don't sugarcoat anything.
Right.
It's
right.
they if they're asking the questions, they understand what's happened at the very least. And I'm not going to say they should, but it's possible they will understand what you're going to tell them too. It's not going to be pretty. It's not a pretty situation. It's never will and never has been.
Because if their trusted adult is not honest with them, we know kids are going to find answers somewhere. Like Aaron, you mentioned, like, people at school maybe, talking, so they'll hear things. Or, hello, everyone has a computer. They will Google and get answers.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you all three support honest conversations.
Yes.
Absolutely. I guess white lies in this situation it just doesn't help out any, because later down the road, it's not even with, like, looking it up. They might believe you just 100%, and they talk to someone and just a lie.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, wait, what?
I think that
Changes
that's
their
really
viewpoint.
important also, is like, if you don't talk to your kid, somebody else might.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't want them to believe those white lies. You don't want them to get, I guess, backhanded information from somebody else. Like, I would much rather my kid come to me, my friend come to me, my mom come to me, and I can let them know, like, this is what you're feeling, or I don't know what you're feeling. Let's go find out together.
Well, I'm sitting here with 3 young adults who are very successful and getting more successful as you keep hitting these milestones, as you said, Aaron. And I like what you said is that you wanted the adults out there to know that their kids will be okay if they have the support. And Philip, what you just added to it is honest and direct information. Talk to me about how your grief continues to show up, because I don't think you've hit the ending point, have you, with your grief?
That the day I die is when I hit that one, literally. I guess grief nowadays isn't like, it's not about sadness or anything anymore nowadays. I'm sure it's a little different for you too, but like when I just remember like I got to spend my life with them, I got the opportunity to talk to them and all that stuff, is like I'm happy for the little time or as much time as I did get. Sadly, I didn't
Pride.
get more.
Sounds
but
like you have some pride.
Yeah,
that
some pride.
relationship.
yeah, so I don't see it as sadness yet. I don't. I'm not gonna say don't miss them, but like it's like I'm more happy than anything that I got to even talk to them in my life.
I was gonna say, like I kind of mentioned, like just something. I guess it's been coming up more now, like since I got my degree and then starting my career and like sort of really like hitting these big like things. Like it's something I've been thinking about that I did maybe when I was younger, but just how much like my dad is missing, right? Like, and that really sucks to think about. Like, I mean, I had thought about that before I walked the stage of graduation that my dad wasn't going to be there, and so it's a hard thing. And then, just thinking about too, like my dad died when I was 13, but he also was in the military and went to Iraq 4 times in about a year each. So really my dad was around for like 9 years of my life.
Yeah.
And I'm, almost 23. So, again, most of my life has been without my dad. So that's hard to think about. And that's kind of the things that I've been thinking about recently and things that continue to show up. And it's probably something I'm going to think about when I get married, when I have kids, and just having to, kind of tell my kids about their grandfather that isn't my stepdad. And so that's kind of what it's been for me recently, and just something that I'm kind of working through, I guess.
So with that, I wanted to talk about memorialization. That's a big part of what we do at camp is with the kids. Obviously, we have a balloon release, but we do other activities throughout camp to help them with memorialization, because we know that we're all going to grieve forever, but we also have the goal of knowing that it's okay to live a wonderful, beautiful life and grieve. And how do you do both of those things? Can you think of ways that you all have continued to work to memorialize your loved ones, and maybe if there's anything in particular that has helped? And I mean, Elijah, I think about you as you have a wedding coming up, and I don't know if that's something you've thought about, like, but I was just curious about memorialization. I think it's important to help adults understand that children, while they're grieving, need to continue to have moments and opportunities to memorialize.
I feel like that's really important. Like what you brought up. I will memorialize my father many times over at my wedding. But it makes me feel, well, it doesn't make me feel like he's still here, but like it's to acknowledge that I'll never forget him. And I feel like you should welcome memorializing. I don't know if too many people out there like shun memorializing, but
it's like kind of hard to do it at the same time, in my opinion, because like in an everyday, like getting up for work and everything, maybe you have a tie from him that you wear every other day, but like it's kind of hard to memorialize him in that type of aspect, because like at your wedding you might have a photo of him in a seat, like you might have specific things just for him. Like within mine, I lost multiple people, so, and I don't have that many things that memorialize them, so I don't get that chance to have memorial. I don't know how both my grandmothers did stuff. I don't know how my second father, how he did stuff, so I don't know how to like bring him up. I just, like, whenever I do stuff and I remember them, I might dedicate that to them in my feelings. But that's really it. that's all I can really do for them.
And that's the great thing about memorialization. It doesn't always have to be something giant like a balloon release. You know, I think you all know this, but at camp, because I get the whistle, you know, the whistle I bring is one of my dad's whistles because my dad was a police officer.
Wow.
So I use his whistle, you know, that I found when I was going through things because he taught, you know, people how to be like the school, what are they called? The school patrol, safety patrol.
Oh, yeah.
So he had a lot of whistle. I always have his whistle at camp. That's the whistle I use. And that's just a way, you know, I don't point that out to anybody, but it's special to me to know that I've got that.
I know for me, like, I mean, you know, people in my family would do different things. Like my sister has a tattoo with my dad's handwriting on it, and she lives out of state with her husband, so she's not like able to like go to the cemetery where he's buried, like here in Memphis, like I am. But that's, I mean, something I do, you know, on death anniversary days or his birthday, I've gone down there. Like I recently went and put a beer over there. I don't know if that's like weird to say now, but so I mean, I did that, and that was cool. Yeah, and just things like, I mean, I think about, you know, my dad being in the military, like, and just things I remember him doing. Like, he was very much somebody who was, like, a servant and like, helping people, and that was something he did. And so I try to think of that, I guess, in things I'm doing now. Like, I mean, I'll just, you know, say that my career, I'm a reporter, and so I know people have different views about that, but the way that I see it and sort of the ideals that I hold to is that I am doing something to help people, that I'm, you know, by providing them with information or whatever the case may be, whatever context I'm doing it in. And so, you know, I may not be able to like join the military like my dad or maybe want to, but I'm helping people in my own way and sort of keeping that memory alive like he did. And just kind of acting that way and hopefully making him proud by doing that, and helping people also and carrying on that tradition. And, you know, so, yeah.
I love that. You guys have covered so much of what I wanted to talk about. What do you feel like we haven't covered, or what do you think is important as we try to get this message out that children and teenagers do in fact grieve, and the work that we do at camp and the centers? I mean, what else do you feel like you want to share?
Find your tribe. I always preach that to the fullest. If you're going through stuff, find one person, two people, but find someone. Never go through it alone. Luckily, I have you guys, and I felt as if like that's like a whole new family, from an extension of my family, and I'm forever grateful about that. In this tribe, I've been able to meet new people. I've been able to build a lot of relationships. I've been able to watch the kids who come back grow. Like, I'm so proud of the two of you. You guys have no idea. Like, oh God. Whenever we'll talk about it, but I'm just being able to watch you guys grow up, knowing that I have people watching me grow up, knowing that I'm always loved, knowing that I always have people to go to, and it's always an abundance of you all. You guys just never leave me alone, but I'm grateful for that. I honestly am. But no, like, find your tribe. Stick with your tribe. Give back to your tribe. Tribe. Yeah.
I think as we just wrap up, just think about one thing. Just take a second and think about one thing that really grieving families really need to hear from former grieving children, now grieving young adults, because grief doesn't end. What's just one really important takeaway that families need to know about childhood and adolescent grief?
It's real.
Don't
downplay it. It's so real. Like, I feel like we've touched on it a little bit, but listen, be honest, take it seriously. Take it seriously, because there's a lot we don't understand about children. Every child is different. But like it's super important to hear your child, listen to your child, listen to a child, even if it's not yours. Listen to a child who's going through something and actually hear them, actually understand what they're going through. Well, try to understand what they're going through, because you probably don't understand what they're going through. You've probably never been through it, but still listen, still be that ear, because I know children say the darndest things, but like, take the time to take it seriously. What if it was you? You know, I'll take it a step further. Like, what if it's your child? What if it's niece, nephew? What if it's somebody who means a lot to you? Like you want to make sure they're getting correct information. You want to make sure that they know they can always come to you, because you don't want them to go to somebody else, like as we also talked about. But like, take it seriously, listen to them, give them reliable information. If you don't know, find out. If you need to go somewhere, if you need to read a book, if you need help, just ask. Like, there's so many different avenues that you can take to help your child, a child, whatever. Just help and take it seriously. Oh my God, take it seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of like on the tribes thing, I just say stick together, man, because I know, like, I mean, I guess it's sort of talking about grief in general, and maybe not necessarily specific to, adolescent and children grief, but I know for me, my dad dying, I mean, it hit different aspects of my family, not just immediate family, but extended family and, grandparents and things like that. And so, but even then, I think the support system that I had, my grandparents taking care of me, and I moved into the city without my mom and my siblings and stuff for a few months. And so I had grandparents taking care of me and family, friends and things like that. And so really just having a lot of people around me to support me and sort of just not giving up on me was really like helpful. And so I think that's the biggest thing. Grief is going to take a toll, I think, on it always takes a toll on families when you lose a family member, right? Because you're sort of missing a piece of the puzzle. But and even though it can sort of, I guess, change the dynamics and affect certain relationships, the biggest thing is to stick together, because I know for like me and my family, I think it's changed us in a lot of ways, but I know like me and my sister are closer than we ever have been, especially than we were as kids, because we fought all the time. And so things like that, I mean, it's just, really, because you need a support system. And I think especially for kids, if they're missing, like, I know like for like me and my dad I was definitely a lot closer to my dad than my mom. Dad was like my best friend. And so, and maybe that's just sort of a boy thing, being attached to your dad. But, then losing that, I needed other people to, I guess, kind of fill that hole and kind of be there for me. And especially as I've been growing up, like I talked about missing those milestones. Like I did not have my dad in very like crucial periods of my life, like teenage years, and now as like a young adult. And so I needed that support to kind of, I guess, learn how to be a person growing up, because I didn't have my dad to teach me those things. So it's just, it's very important to stick together. So
One thing to take away probably is, since we will grieve till we die, of course, the extremes of what a child might go through. They're still learning. They one weekend, they're going to be hurt, but they don't know what they're going to be in a year in. It could get worse. It could get better. It's just the matter of how they go with it. It's just going to be extreme all the way through, as what Elijah says. You're fighting to this day.
Well, let me ask two last questions. One, you may have to think about this for a minute. It's an odd question. But if you had to describe your grief today by what it looks like, what would you say your grief looks like today?
Green.
Green?
Green. It's peaceful. I'm happy with most of the things. Yeah, it could be a little sad sometimes, but it's mostly happy. I would have said yellow, but I'm more of
green.
The flow.
Okay.
So.
Looks like it's water, because water doesn't have a shape, right? It takes the shape of the container it's in. You spill it on the floor, it kind of goes all over the place. So it's I'm in like one of those points in my life where I'm like figuring a bunch of stuff out and things are changing. And so I think that is shaping my grief as well. Because again, just as I'm hitting these different milestones, and that's causing me to think about it in ways that I didn't as a kid, because I'm going through different things. And so as I change, the grief is changing, I think. So
Water. I like that.
So I always describe my grief like vegetables because grief is necessary. You don't always want to deal with grief, but you need to.
That is so awesome.
I'm fine. I'm glad I'm finally able to like
I love that.
say that out loud. But like whenever I think about grief, I always think about vegetables. And I'm like, as
Necessary,
a kid,
but you don't always want it.
which ones though? Is it asparagus or is it like?
It's just like a cornucopia of vegetables. Like it because I mean, like growing up, I hated talking about my feelings just because it's so elaborate. And growing up, I also hated vegetables. I don't hate vegetables now. No, it's hard to tell, but I know how important grief is. I know how important vegetables are, and if you do it nicely, like if you if you dress it up real nice, and if you like just take care of grieving, addressing it, channeling it in a proper way, then it's not that bad, you know? So.
I love how different you guys. That's why I love that question. It's so unique, but you each had your own specific way of what grief looks like, and that really speaks to the uniqueness of grief. So thank you. One last question specifically for you two. Talk a minute about grief counseling. Like, what was grief counseling like for you? And how would you encourage other children and teens to do that? Because that can be really scary for counseling.
So when I first started trying different grief counselors, it was a little difficult. I think we went to 2 different places. And it's not that like they were bad or anything. They just didn't fit. Like I didn't want to be there. Outside of the reason why I was there, I just didn't want to be there. But it's important to keep trying. Like I didn't like the first 2, but the third one was a banger. Like the third one was absolutely amazing. And it's rough through the years because I still hate talking about my feelings just because of the absolute roller coaster you go on. Grief counseling, or just counseling in general, but grief counseling especially. But it definitely helps. I am starting to understand how necessary it is, although we might not want to deal with it. It's very necessary to talk to someone, because I mean, like, family doesn't always have the answers, like I just said, or like I said earlier. So like going to somebody who does have the answers, and hearing their take and taking their recommendations to heart and listening to what they say and doing what they say. It's a big help. And I find myself sometimes, like I feel like I need to just hop on down to 1520 Poplar Avenue and see what Barbara's doing, because sometimes I need to talk, and that's perfectly normal.
Yeah.
But yeah, like it's necessary. It is normal. And then it helps out a lot. It really does.
And I want to clarify, those first 2 counselors weren't at the Center for Good Grief.
That's what it was.
Teasing. AJ, any thoughts about counseling?
Yeah, I think it's important to caveat first, like for me, that I think my counseling is a lot different than a lot of people. A lot of the stuff that I went through with my dad and how he died was laced with a lot of trauma stuff. Like I was diagnosed with PTSD when I was about 13 years old after my dad died. So a lot of what I was doing was getting me to the point that I could actually talk about how my dad died without going into an episode. Because the PTSD and the mental trauma was sending me into like dissociative states. And so that was really what I was doing in the very beginning, was just getting to a point that I could sort of recognize what happened and talk about it with somebody without like freaking out. But that being said, I do definitely, absolutely recommend not only grief counseling, but therapy in general for anybody. I'm a huge proponent of that, because that is really what, one of the biggest parts of why I am where I am today is because of that, because I had somebody to talk through that stuff with me. And like you said, Elijah, it's important to find somebody that you can sort of jive with, because I went through a similar experience going through a counselor before I came to the grief center that just couldn't handle the situation. And so it's important to find somebody that is willing to work with you, that isn't going to shy away from talking about stuff with you, and that can truly handle it. And it's not to say that people, certain people aren't qualified or something like that. It's just people are people, and we have feelings and reactions to things, even when you're a licensed therapist. Like it's just one of those things. And maybe they haven't been doing it very long. Who knows? And so I think it is important to find somebody who really can work with you and that you really feel good about, especially if you're going to see them for an extended period of time. But I definitely recommend that it just in general. It's so. I think as I get older too, like I mentioned, kind of how grief changes, like you start to, I guess, maybe feel differently about things, or maybe feelings come up that you didn't know you had before. And so it's really important to kind of work through that with somebody, and just having somebody to talk to in general. Like I know me, like I am kind of a homebody sometimes. I'm definitely getting better about that. But for a long time, I just haven't had a lot of close friends, like outside of like work friends and stuff. And so, I'm kind of like to myself. So just to have somebody to talk to about your problems, just stuff you're going through, is super important. And it sounds so simple, like just basically telling somebody what's going on. But people that know more than you do about psychology and all that kind of stuff, you'd be surprised about the things that they say. And you kind of go, wow, like I didn't think about it in that way. And so, I don't know, that's always been super helpful for me. And especially with the Grief Center, with it being free, is a really awesome thing. So, and that's, compared to, other just normal therapy places, it's free. So it's totally worth it, and you literally have like nothing to lose. So.
Well, thank you. And I just have to say again, I'm so proud to sit at this table with you three. Just so proud of you. I have so much gratitude for each of you. I obviously wish you never needed the centers, but I'm certainly glad you had people in your family who found the centers. But then you three have said yes over and over to me. Today is another example of saying yes, but saying yes to coming and giving back to younger children and helping them see that they can have a bright future with their grief. So thank you each so much. So another thing with teens that we get asked a lot about are risk-taking behaviors. Why are they doing it, and how can I make them stop?
Right. We spoke a lot in the last episode about how a very common grief reaction for children and teenagers is to test boundaries, because it feels like the rug has been ripped out from under them. Their whole world's been turned upside down. No child or teenager will ever admit to you that they like structure and they like expectations, but they do. They really thrive on that because it gives them a sense of security. And so when they have experienced a great loss, that sense of structure is shaken. That sense of security is shaken. And a lot of times kids will try to test those boundaries. They will try to figure out what the structure is now. And so sometimes that can take the form of acting out behaviors, and then sometimes that can take the form of various risky behaviors. And another thing to keep in mind with this, I think, is that teens often feel out of control as they try to cope with the loss. And in an attempt to control this experience and an attempt to lessen the pain, sometimes they try to push their feelings away. They try to avoid them. And so sometimes in order to do this, they resort to behaviors that, for them in the moment feel very big and exciting, and we view them as risky. And that's an attempt to avoid that pain, and an attempt to lessen that pain and to push it away and distract from it. A lot of times, too, I think teenagers normally tend to feel very invincible. And so if you add the fact that they feel out of control, that they maybe feel even hopeless at times, and you add that to this feeling of invincibility, that's when you'll see the risky behavior. And so how that might look might be, alcohol use, substance use, sexual behaviors, various other dangerous or risk-taking behaviors like thrill-seeking kind of behaviors. And, what we would encourage parents and guardians to do is to just kind of be aware, just have your radar up for any changes in behavior or mood that you're seeing with your teenager. We've talked before about the importance of sort of establishing ongoing communication with your teenager in whatever way feels right to them and feels right for your family, and definitely do that, because that allows you to monitor any of those changes over time, and it creates a safe place for teenagers to talk and share if maybe they are engaging in some of these behaviors or experiencing the temptation or the urge to engage in some of these behaviors, and that way you can address it with them and talk with them about it on an ongoing basis, and also know too when it maybe has reached a point where it would be good to seek professional help.
And some of those can be numbing, right? We do these behaviors to not have to feel and to shove it down, and so I think that's a temptation to not have to feel for 10 minutes, 5 minutes,
And also it goes back to development. Adolescents do not have full frontal lobe development in their brains. And so they need us as the adults and caregivers to put limits and to to have discussions about these things, because they don't have the ability to think these things all the way through because of going, again, back to their development. And so, yes, it may be to numb. It may be like what we were saying earlier. What does it even matter anymore? I'm just surrounded by all these terrible things. So I'm going to push the limits, like you were saying, Lauren. And so we have to be mindful that some of this is definitely has a role in their development, where they are with that brain development. Also, then what the grief adds to that in terms of an emotional response.
Yeah, I think it can just definitely magnify, because teens naturally, developmentally, that risky behavior can be just part of the natural process. But then you add grief on top of it, and it can become bigger. And so I think parents have to be, or caregivers have to be, much more aware.
And aware that these are red flags. And so when we see these red flags, like Lauren said, I need to get some professional help. I need to seek out help beyond just our family and really get some help with this, because the potential it has to become bigger. When we see that red flag, it's a red flag for a reason.
And sometimes I think with teens, what we do is encourage families to say, we're all going to get counseling. The family's going. You're going.
Yes.
Because they're not naturally going to be like, I want to go to grief counseling.
Right.
So I think if they know this is what everyone in the family's doing,
Right.
it sort of helps them come. And I think once they come in for grief counseling and they see what it is, then they're not as resistant.
Absolutely. I'm not the one with the identified problem, because our whole family is grieving. Right. Well, let's talk about, so another question that families ask a lot is just trying to find that space of respecting their teens' feelings and grief, but also kind of continuing to manage the family as a whole.
Well, we talked a lot about their teenagers' brain development and their frontal lobe isn't developed, but what is all the way developed is their feelings. They can feel every single feeling that we do as adults. And maybe they don't have always the language to express those nuanced emotions, right? We may feel angry we may feel resentful and just say, I feel angry. And that's a more nuanced emotion, right? To talk about resentment or to talk about regret. Or things like that. And so I think, in counseling sessions, sometimes I will pull out an emotions wheel that has all these emotions on it, and we will really look at these different nuanced emotions. And so I think the biggest thing is just knowing that they are feeling the same feelings that you can feel, and trusting that that's their truth. Even if your feelings are different than your teen's feelings, really allowing them that space to feel whatever it is, sad, anger, guilt, regret, confusion, fear, frustration. I mean, the whole gauntlet. And it's important to validate those feelings. We have a saying around here that feelings aren't right, feelings aren't wrong. It's just how you feel. And minimizing feelings or, kind of dismissing feelings with our teenagers can be really incredibly hurtful for our teens. And it can almost send this inadvertent message that, oh, you're not a safe person to talk with.
Absolutely.
Oh, I'm shut down. Teens are quick to judge this is a safe space or this is a not safe space. And so really approaching it with curiosity, asking questions if they'll let you, right? And listening just to understand. And we mess up, we make mistakes, we may minimize on accident, and owning that. I think a teen really responds well when we own our mistakes as an adult and say, you know what, I wasn't listening well. The other day when we were in a fight and you were feeling really angry, I thought it was about maybe the fact that your curfew's 11, but now that I think about it, maybe it's some other things, just kind of returning. Don't be afraid to return to a conversation with your teen. I think that communicates so much to them.
And I think just hearing them, listening to them, even though sometimes as adults we may know things that could be really helpful in that moment, it may just not be the right time. And I think we have to remember that. Just so that goes back to that minimizing, just really hearing them and letting them own it. So the interesting thing with this podcast is knowing that we were going to be talking about adolescent grief, we sat down with about 20 teenagers and we asked them what they wanted us to talk about. And so first we started with, what do you want adults to know about your grief? So tell us what they said.
Some of the things that they said are that grief doesn't always come out in the same way. Again, not every teen grieves in the same way. Not every teen has the same needs. And so, of course, it's just so important to ask them what they need, what is helpful for them, what is not helpful for them. And one thing that they really emphasized is after you ask, listen to our answer. Because I think for teenagers especially, there's just such a need for them to feel heard. I think one thing that they really wanted for us to know is that just because they may not always show their grief, it doesn't mean that it's not there. And sometimes their grief reactions may look like anger or, shutting down or closing off, like they're mad, but it's not necessarily anger. It may be that they're overwhelmed. It may be that there are certain triggers that they're having a hard time even identifying or putting words to or even beginning to make sense of. And so, a lot of times we'll write teenagers' behavior off as just attitude, and it may not be so simple that just because they may not be very expressive doesn't mean that they're angry. It just may mean that it's hard in that moment for them to be able to express it.
And Lauren, I think, we talk a lot about identity forming in teenagers, and a piece of that is also kind of that gender piece of our identity. And with the teens we sat down with, the boys, young men especially, talked a lot about the difficulty of being a guy and expressing your feelings, right? And how difficult that is for a grown man, let alone for a teen boy who's in high school and in this really vacuum esque almost society of their high schools, right? Like people are always kind of looking at one another and judging one another and trying to figure out, how do I fit into this puzzle? And there's this pressure, this urge, this desire to present yourself in a certain way so that you fit in this puzzle where you want. And a piece of that is our gender and is our masculinity. And I mean, clearly I'm not the best person to be talking about this, but just kind of communicating what these boys told us, that that's a big piece, especially for these young men who have lost a male role model. And maybe they're at home with a grandmother or a mother. And that's a big piece that they're just trying to navigate. So maybe we do need to provide an opportunity to talk to a male role model for some of these guys.
Another thing that this group told us, which actually just reinforced something that, I think we've talked about a little bit in the last episode, is that grief affects our ability to concentrate. It affects our motivation. And so, of course, we see that with kids often in school and other things, extracurricular activities and things like that. So, sometimes kids may lose interest in some of those things that maybe used to be a big part of their life, or maybe, they have a hard time keeping their grades up. And it's not that they're trying to be lazy. It's that their grief. And that's one thing that these teens that we talked about really reinforced and wanted to say, is that grief can make us feel unmotivated sometimes.
And then they really, really talked a lot about just normalize talking about grief. You're not going to remind me that I'm grieving. I'm already grieving. You're not going to remind me to miss my person. I already miss my person. So really normalizing, doing our best to make it feel as comfortable as possible talking about our grief with our teens. And it's unlikely that they're going to come to you and say, knock, knock, knock on your door, hey, loved one, I want to talk about my grief with you. So providing that space and providing that opportunity and maybe even modeling it.
So another thing we asked our teens is, we said a lot of people tell us that they think teens are not affected by grief, or that teens act like they don't really care. And so we asked them for their thoughts on that.
Well, I think what we would hear from teens is that they really care. They care big. They really do. And they just don't always express it in ways that we can see. That, just because they may look one way on the outside does not mean that that's how they look on the inside.
I think one of the things that really stuck with me from the group when we asked them is just the vulnerability that they were really able to express, especially some of the teens who had a parent die. And they said, I'm not ready for my parent to not be here anymore. I'm not ready for them to miss out on my growing up. So of course I care, but I don't know what to do with this. I don't know how to do this to keep living without them. And I just thought that vulnerability was so real. And that's really something they wanted us to share here.
They also just talked about how hard it is being a teenager in general.
Yeah.
And then you add grief on top of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we also asked them, what did they want their family members to know? Or what did they think family members really need to know about grief as a teenager?
Well, one thing that one of the girls who was talking with us said is, teens are not aliens. They're actual people too. And they're just figuring out how to grieve.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think we add some mystery and almost fear of teens. We treat them almost sometimes like a foreign land that we don't understand. And they talked a lot about kind of that assumption, people assume that I'm really closed off, or people assume I'm not grieving, or people assume it's going to be really difficult to talk to me about this. But that's not true. I'm a person too. I'm feeling just like you are. It just shows up and looks differently for me.
And I mean, sometimes they really do present in a way that makes us afraid to ask them. I mean, they're Their nonverbal language can be telling us a lot of things. And, we asked them about that. And I think they were able to identify that as possibly a defense mechanism, or just some of them, I don't even know that they're really aware. They're trying to cope with so much. I think one of them said, "I'm doing my best to survive, and I don't really know what I look like on the outside." And so I thought that was interesting too. And also that grief is not just an adult problem. They probably said that, gosh, 5 or 6 times, really wanting their adults to know that we know you're grieving, we understand that, but it's not just you.
Another thing that they said so many times in so many different ways is that it is really bothersome to them when people say, "We understand where you're coming from." That's something that I think grieving people in general can feel a little guarded about, and teens especially, because I think developmentally part of being a teenager is sort of feeling misunderstood. And then, again, you add your grief on top of that, and you have someone coming in and saying, "I understand how you feel." And again, those statements come from a good place. We're trying to show empathy. And sometimes, we may have experienced a loss too, and we know what grief is like, and so we feel confident in saying, "I understand how you feel." But I think it's important to keep in mind that nobody fully understands what another person is feeling. Two grieving people don't understand exactly how the other is feeling because everyone's experience is so different.
So we also talked about the difference in those relationships in the family and what can lead to maybe some complications within the family, within the differences of relationships.
And something I thought was just incredibly insightful is they talked about how, grief and love is not measured by time. Oftentimes an adult will have known the person who died longer than the teen because they've just been alive longer. And the teens really wanted to communicate, that doesn't mean you're grieving harder. That doesn't mean you loved them more than me. It just means our grief is different.
Right.
And my grief is valid too. Even if I'm presenting this hard shell, I've got this soft, gooey center, and it's hurting.
I thought that was really insightful that they could be so open about that. And I really, I don't know about you all, but I saw just that support that came when they identified, like, yes, I feel the same way. And maybe some of them have gotten messages like that from their family members, but that love is not measured by the length of time you knew someone.
And especially in a family system, like there's different ways we know one another in a family system. You may know your sibling in a much different way than your parent knew your sibling. Yeah. You just relate differently.
So as we wrap up, I just kind of like you three to think about, what's a takeaway from this episode that you want adults to have about how do I support my grieving teen?
I think my rule of thumb is staying curious. That a teen's way of expression may look different, may sound different, may feel different than yours, and just really listening to understand, asking to understand, and listening to that answer like they asked us to, and knowing that, this is going to heal if and when I create this environment for them to heal. And I think the curiosity is just such an important piece with teenagers to allow them to do that important, healthy developmental work of searching for meaning, finding their new identity, not only developmentally, but through their grief and learning who they are as they grow through both these times in their lives.
I love that. Mm-hmm. Stay curious.
I like that as well. And mine would actually be a continuation of that I just think it's so important for teens to feel heard. And so, yes, stay curious, ask those questions, listen to their answers, but also communicate to them that you've heard those answers, whether that's, kind of reflecting back to them what they've said to make sure that you understood, and whether that's also following up with it by your actions and showing them that you heard them and that it mattered by how you respond to that, not just in the immediate moment, but over time.
And I guess for me, I'm thinking about the adults. Mm-hmm. And it's hard being a parent of a teen. And normal circumstances, and then you add grief on top of that. So I would just say, just to remember to take care of yourself as the caregiver. Take care of your grief so that you can do these things that we're talking about for your teen. And just know that you're not going to have all the answers, but with patience and understanding, you'll get through it.
I think that's so important, and I will just echo that you know, it takes a village to support a grieving family, and you know, we just have to remember that we don't have to have all the answers. There are people out there that we can lean on for support. Again, while we're doing this podcast, is talking through this, that you know, teen grief is real, and but that doesn't mean that they're going to have a maladjusted life, or, you know, this terrible future ahead of them. And so I think the four of us sitting here, again, we have seen our teenagers grieve well into their futures. And so listeners, we hope that you can hear that, and you can borrow that hope from us for sure. Like we always say, grief is real, so real, and so very big. Thank you, Barbara, Hannah, and Lauren. I'm so honored to know each of you, and so privileged to get to work with you too. To our listeners, childhood and adolescent grief does heal. Let me say that again. Childhood and adolescent grief does heal. But we know that grief demands attention and care. It also demands support and patience. So much support and patience sometimes with children and teens. Remember that grief is a reflection of love, and that you are not alone. The world is full of grievers just like you. You can learn more about us at www.baptistgriefcenters.org. You can visit our YouTube channel, Baptist Centers for Good Grief. And our next podcast will be available wherever you get your podcast. And remember, grief is real, big, and better shared. We'll talk soon.